It's good to be here with you. And yeah, like being in a university setting also makes me think about my childhood and about like not. I think that I'm kind of like two things as a curator. I am a little bit of a frustrated scholar and who never made it into an academic career, and also like you always have to have a B plan. So I think that I will be an amazing truck driver if this doesn't work for real. And now I'm testing all of those skills while living in LA. And I was telling you that I feel like there is something very special about being in a university setting because so as some of you might know, I grew up in Guatemala, not in Guatemala City, but in this little town called Quetzaltenango. Andy was there. Actually, I saw him dancing in Quetzaltenango. Can you imagine? It's true, yeah. And so I grew up in the 80s in Guatemala, and well, Guatemala had this long civil war, 36 years of an internal civil war. So it's one of the countries with one of the longest civil wars in Latin America during the military dictatorships. So I'm from 1982, so I grew up. My first 10 years were more or less in the middle of an internal war, and my two parents were university professors. My dad was an economist, and my mother is a social worker. So and universities would be especially targeted by repressive regimes. The military dictatorship, which committed like a huge genocide in the 80s, and university professors would be as well targeted. So there was this whole thing where my mom went to exile at some point, working at the public university, Universidad de San Carlos. And in the case of Latin America, public universities are really, or have been really, really important. Like grounds where like many students and revolutionary activists were just. University would be a place where people would also like hide and have like very intense conversations. And at some point, militaries would come and erupt into classes. So this gathering that we're having here in the 80s would be kind of impossible to have. And at some point, when my mother came back from exile, I was 8 years old. So I went back to her and we moved back to her hometown. And so she would bring me to classes because, she was a single mom, and sometimes she just had no one to leave me with at home. So I would be like 8 years old, like having these hours of like super boring classes about human rights and Marxism and all of that. So it was intense, but also like I guess I at some point just grew used to a university setting. And then I didn't study art or art history. I studied political science in my, you would call it an undergrad, but in Latin America you have licenciaturas, which is like a grad. It's like a 5-6 years. I did political science because there is no way you can study like art history or art in my hometown. And yeah, like it was just kind of like a way for me, I guess, to kind of reconciliate and with that history that is very personal, but also it belongs to many. And at some point I thought that I wanted to be an academic, and I was thinking, I will do like a PhD or like an MA, and then I tried to apply for like a Fulbright to come to this country and study, and I didn't get it. I was about to, but in the interview, they asked me if I would come back to my home country after doing because Fulbrights work that way. So you need to go back to your home country after you finish your studies. And I was just too honest, so I was just like, I don't think I will go back. And it was more like, I was not thinking really in staying in the US, but I was more like, I think that I kind of like the idea of not just moving around. So I thought, if I do an MA or a PhD, maybe I will go somewhere else or I will get a job. Anyway, that was like kind of like a hard no. and they really want you to go back. So I did an MA, but I did it in London, and at some point I just kind of decided that I was just going to pursue art, exhibition making, and I guess curatorial practice. But a good part of what I do is rooted in like thinking and producing things and writing. And I think one of the lacks of, or one of the paradoxes of curatorial practice is that there is no time for research and writing and theory, whatever that means. In the sense that curators, especially institutional curators, we are doing the shows, but also there is a lot of work related to administration and mails and so on. I know academic work has also a huge load of that. It's not that you're all the time just like writing in your library or whatever. But I think one of the problems with curatorial practice is that you need to come out with relevant exhibitions, right? And in order to do so, you need to research and you need to think and you need to write. But we are not having or finding the time. So I think that that's why sometimes you see so many kind of like sort of like hard theory, light text kind of thing when you like read a curatorial text or a text in a catalog. And this is not it is a critique to myself and my colleagues, but it's also like a kind of like a question on how we reconcile the fact that what we do is exhibitions, but also we need to have a solid track on writing and on theorizing. One of my ways is that I try to do things outside museum practices. So I have another project that I won't present this time because it's not enough time. It's called Infrasonica, and it's kind of the space where I get to do whatever I want with other two colleagues, one in Barcelona and the other in Milan. And it is a curatorial platform for kind of sonic non-Western cultures. So it's a huge sort of like kind of digital archive, and we work with artists and curators, writers, and so on. And the other thing, I guess that it's an interesting conversation to have, not today, is what's the relationship between theory and exhibition making, and how is that for academics sometimes it's so hard to relate to curatorial practice as with curators relate to like academic practice. And I think that is something probably we will need to start thinking about more critically, hopefully in the near future. This talk is gonna have like two moments. One is I'm gonna share with you some ideas that have kind of permeated the way I think of art and the way I think of exhibition making. So that's a little more just kind of like going through the history of like indigenous contemporary art in Guatemala and abroad, and some ideas on like mestizaje and I guess you could call it brownness and indigeneity. And the second moment, I'm just gonna present you some images of Made in LA. Did you see the show already or no? Like half of the room saw it or no? Okay, it's great if you haven't, because then it's gonna be, it's just gonna be new stuff. And I think some of you might come to the museum also, to the seminar and so on. So yeah. Yeah? Okay. So I always start my talks with this image of, this is the Krakatoa, which is a volcano in Indonesia. In 19th century, there was this big eruption, and it was the kind of loudest sound ever recorded. And one of the things about sound that I like as some kind of theoretical device is that allows me to think of, for instance, like sound and infrasound as a metaphor of like things that probably we don't see, or things that are so strong but are not easily perceived by human ear. So in this case, the stronger sound of Krakatoa's eruption was registered in infrasound, which is actually not perceptible by human ear. And there are many natural phenomena that relate to infrasound, which is a very, very strong, loud sound that is not perceptible by humans. So I just like the idea of the Krakatoa, the eruption, and how that kind of, marked kind of like a sort of geological moment in history. As I said before, 3 ideas: ancestrality, race, and translation, and then made in LA. And then in the end, we can do Q&A, and if something is not clear, you let me know, and we'll try to come up with something. So when thinking about ancestrality, I refer to this image that has helped me to shape how is that I'm approaching this. This is the tomb of Cuauhtémoc, the last Tlatoani Mexica. Tlatoani would be in kind of pre-colonial times in the Azteca Empire as sovereign. But the sovereign would not just hold political power, but also would be some kind of like moral compass on like how the community would act and how they would produce, how they would produce culture, how they would relate to war, and so on. So Cuauhtémoc was killed by the Spanish, and then his bones, as it happened with many indigenous leaders in Mesoamerica and abroad, that like they would be killed and then their rest would be burned or hidden or something, right? So the idea was to kind of destroy any trace of materiality that could somehow make people do some kind of connections with indigenous histories and resistance, for instance. And what is interesting about that is like then matter, in this case the bones, become some kind of symbol. So we are, or in this case the settlers, the colonial settlers, were also afraid of the bones. So it was not just about killing the person, but destroying every possible trace, as it happens with genocide as well, at least ideologically, that's the idea, right? So then in the early 20th century, someone came out with like the news that they knew where the bones were hidden. And they were in this little beneath this little Catholic church. And the whole thing is that, it was early 20th century in Mexico. So as you know, early 20th century, kind of like the construction of the sort of ideological project of the mestizo national Mexican state. So indigenismo played an important role in order to do so. And there were some millennial indigenous movements that were seen as a threat to the construction of the Mexican state. So, the state sent like a commission of people to investigate if those were actually Cuauhtémoc bones. And then there was an independent commission led by Elena Guzman, which was an anthropologist. And, there would be like architects, archaeologists, linguists, and just people were trying to figure out if those could be potentially the bones of Cuauhtémoc. So like kind of pure scientific speculation. And this commission, this independent commission, said in the end that those were actually Cuauhtémoc bones, or most likely. And the official commission of the Mexican state said, no, actually, those are not. Beyond that, or despite kind of all of the debate, this was constructed and it is now a monument. People, not a monument, but the bones are being there all the time, and there is this kind of annual pilgrimage to see the bones, and like a whole kind of millennial indigenous movement started to kind of move around the idea of Cuauhtémoc bones. So what is interesting for me about this and why this speaks of ancestrality is that the idea of ancestrality, to put this in simple terms, is the possibility of thinking of a time before history. So how is that we relate to the possibility of time before history? And by history, I mean the kind of the development of the Western teleological project of time, teleology meaning linear. So ancestrality is non-linear time, and it is a possibility of something, like some existence, people actually living before colonial time. And when we speak about indigeneity or indigenous cultures and art, there is something about art making that somehow connects as some kind of portal to the idea of ancestrality. I don't know if I'll get to show you something of this, but it's an idea that I think if you are interested in this topic, it's important to explore. Also, ancestrality, it's very, very complicated for kind of the Western mind because you cannot access notions of ancestrality through kind of a rational discourse. So that's why art or different kind of rituals are so important, because they allows you to access a content that exists prior to a Western language, for instance, right? So in this case, colonization, and I'm sorry about this, it's in Spanish, but I know many of you speak Spanish, so I should have done a new one. I'm sorry. So this is just a little map. You can take it or leave it. But so the thing with ancestrality or lo ancestral is that it relates to it's previous to the construction of the indigenous subject as such. And one of the problems with talking about indigenous art or indigenous subjects is that the indigenous is also part of a colonial project. You have indigenous because you have a settler colonial project there. So it's kind of the world we have, but the way I think of this is, so you have ancestrality as some kind of like time before history, or as I said here, like the word before language, which is just kind of like a play on words. The possibility of an ontology that exists before colonial translation, so, as with Spanish settlers, like indigenous knowledge and so on was somehow kind of translated to Spanish or obliterated, as it happens with so many pre-Hispanic sacred books that were burned and so on. But then you have this, and we're just thinking about concepts, right? We have this, the idea of the indigenous subject, and that relates to, the present. So that's why we are able to speak about indigenous artists, indigenous folks, indigenous peoples, but also is part of a modern colonial project. So for me, the idea of the contemporary in terms of like art, for example, it works in this paradox. So when we speak about indigeneity or indigenous art, we are always speaking from a paradoxical place. It's not a place of any kind of essence or of identitarian affirmation, but it's a place of contradiction. Oh, sorry, I was going backwards. And just a few, this is an image, this is the so-called pintura de castas, and it's just very interesting because it shows in a very almost kind of like an obvious way how ideologically like class and race societies in Latin America were depicted, and how the babies in this pintura de castas were kind of like the ideological project of the mestizo state. So it was always, a mestizo baby, and that's one of the things with mestizaje that we are trying to get rid of in terms of how we discuss ideas of mestizaje, because mestizo, as the pintura de castas depicts, is an hegemonic project. It's a project of domination. So the independence from colonial Spanish settlers in Latin America came at the cost of, we need to invent something, and this should be a nation state, and this nation state should be a mestizo state. And that's one of the reasons on why, for instance, we speak about mestizos, or in Guatemala we call it Ladinos, literally as a mix of indigenous and Spanish settlers, but the mestizo has been an hegemonic group within those countries. While if you see in Canada, for instance, we speak about métis, which is also literally a mestizo, French settler and indigenous, but the métis were not an hegemonic group. The nation state in Canada is white. So the métis can affirm some kind of indigeneity. So the Métis in Canada are actually First Nations. The Métis nationality, while in Latin America you cannot do that. So the mestizos live in this kind of like paradox, because you are indigenous, but also you're mixed. But part of your identity is based on the negation of your own indigeneity. And I'm saying this because LA is is a place where I think all of these questions are at stake. And we can see that with so many Latino artists doing work that kind of speaks to indigenous traditions, but they are, I don't know, first, second generation. So how we think about that. And this is one of the big, I guess, not just paradoxes, but like tragedy of thinking of mestizaje. And my point, especially with art, is that we need to think about a different way of kind of theorizing and thinking about mestizaje, especially with this big population in LA of Central American and Mexican American artists. I'm not gonna read this. But what I'm gonna say about that, because it's a quote, is so multiculturalism is this kind of form of, of how neoliberalism deals with cultural diversity, right? So you have like, and especially in the US, the presence of like the logic of identity politics is so strong within art institutions and museums, right? So, and I'll try to say how is that we thought about that within Made in LA. But one of the challenges is to think outside the logic of identity politics or neoliberal multiculturalism. And I'm not sure how to do that. But it's important just to be aware of that. And, like in the art world, like just to put it very kind of simple, after the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, museums and even universities started to kind of rethink their curricula, their collections. And one of the challenges was that, it was a surprise for them, but like they realized that most of their collections were of white Western male artists, right? So there were from before many other efforts trying to kind of decentralize that, but museums like MoMA or Tate, like big kind of global museums, started to organize their collections in different ways through different strategies. So in some cases, they started forming acquisition committees from Africa, Southeast Asia, Latin America. Tate formed its Latin American Acquisition Committee in the early 2000s. So if you think about that, it's very, very recent. And as it happened with Tate, many other museums started kind of like looking outside. Before that, they would acquire Latin American works, but it would be just like exceptions or within like a very kind of sort of canonic form of art. And at the side of that, there was this kind of boom of biennales. So many biennales, like every big city wanted to have some kind of major international biennale, right? So, like, I don't know, Berlin, Cuenca in Ecuador, like it was this kind of explosion. So the biennales, the decentralization of collections comes after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the kind of the construction of some kind of like multipolar world, where still Europe and the US had the hegemony on what means to diversify what and who is allowed to have a voice in that kind of like polyphony or diversity of voices. But the tricky part is that decentralization process came at the side of the neoliberalization of the market. So also more galleries. So there is kind of a weird parallelism between neoliberalization and identity politics. So it's kind of like the way, and it's basically the main language we have now to speak of art. And that's why, for instance, when we do a show, we think, okay, how many of this, how many of what? But the problem with thinking about quotas is that we leave aside the nuances and the connections, as it happens with mestizaje, for instance. We leave aside, for instance, what about like diasporic cultures, or what about histories of mestizaje that are post-colonial or that happened within the colony with like African enslaved people that met Taínos in Puerto Rico and so on. So there are many nuances that the logic of identity politics leave aside because kind of doesn't fit the grid. And if you are interested in translation and these kind of things, and multiculturalism and so on, there are so many things to check. But just thinking of translation, this is a good book that at least helped me a lot when thinking about this. And Naoki Sakai is one of the few that has theorized about translation in relation to identity. And this is a book about the construction of kind of like Japanese national culture. And it's really interesting. It's kind of easy to read. And I will just, again, another thing, this time in English. So Sakai has two kind of instances. So what is kind of beautiful of Sakai is that he's like, everyone engages in translation all the time. And for me, an exhibition, for instance, is a translation device. So I'm not trying to show some kind of purity of anything, right? I'm not trying to show every artist in their kind of splendor. I know that when I do a show, my subjectivity and my taste is taking a part on it. And the artists that I decide to work with are also, I'm not neutral. I know that there is something that I'm kind of looking for. And in that sense, an exhibition is a translation device. An art object is a translation device. But following the logic of Sakai, there are two kind of main instances of translation. One is plurilingual translation, and there is the homolingual translation. And for Sakai, homolingual translation is where all the idea of kind of regimes of truth comes. So identity politics, this is that, this is Latinx, this is indigenous, so this kind of grid sort of categorization. And I add to that homolingual translation in a way is kind of the original sin of coloniality. It's not just about conquer and violence, it's also about translating meaning. On the other hand, for Sakai, plurilingual translation is, what I would like to think that artists and, curators and writers do in some cases. That is, you don't communicate, but you address things, you point at things. And then people is able, ideally, to make their own connections. Kind of, again, with a show, the way that I try to think of an exhibition is, kind of like a space where you are allowed to make your own connections and you are not completely guided. So there is some kind of chaos, some sort of like kind of jazz-y kind of vibe where, there is a little bit of improvisation, things that are not completely under control. And as you will see with Made in LA, we didn't do a wall text for every section, for instance. So you have a wall text that introduces you to the show, but then even though we have sections, you don't know when you are moving between them. Ideally, you would realize, but it's something, that is more of kind of a spatial form of thinking. So, again, Marisol de la Cadena is thinking a lot about mestizaje through kind of an indigenous lens. She's an anthropologist teaching at Columbia, and she's interesting. So she says translations are misunderstandings that can be productive, says Benjamin. He adds that a successful translation acknowledges its role by commenting on differences and misunderstandings. Viveros de Castro and Strattern would add that the comment should not stop at the empirical fact of the misunderstanding, but should discuss or make otherwise visible the mutual excess, and if possible, what makes them such. So again, also the idea of excess, I think is important, and because we're talking about shows, exhibitions here, there is this thing that I was also discussing with colleagues at the Hammer, and it is that it sounds like a little polemical, but like for me, there are good exhibitions with not great art and bad exhibitions with great art, because I don't think that anything is guaranteed even if you have great art on it. I think that it's more about sometimes the connections and the excess that you provoke within those connections. So the idea of excess is also like, the sum, how is the thing? Like 1 by 1, 1 plus 1 doesn't equal 2, but there is always an excess that is produced by like 2 or more art objects in connection to each other. And that excess somehow should be channeled by the curatorial project. How you show or how you deal with that excess that different objects having the space. Okay, so we'll talk about Made in LA. I don't know if we should, if you have questions, we should say, but probably no, I should just follow, right? What do you think? Follow. Yeah? Okay, okay. So, okay, so the show opened a month ago. We are very tired. And it's been a ride, and you know these shows are always like that. It's not particular of this project. So just for you to have an idea on how this worked, last year I was living in Berlin with my wife, that is seated there, and we just moved 4 months ago. So it was a big change, and last year the idea was that I would do back and forth. So the first I knew that I was going to get a job at the Hammer, but we could not do the thing backwards. So we first announced the project with the two curators, Diana and me, but also because we were doing all the paperwork. So the show, usually for a Biennale you need like 2 years if you're gonna try to do something with it. The thing with Made in LA is that it's not an international Biennale in the sense of, I don't know, the Berlin Biennale or the Istanbul, whatever, but it's also not a local Biennale. It is something that kind of transits between being very specific because it's about LA. I mean, all artists included live and work in LA, but also, as you know, like the world is contained somehow here, right? So everyone moves to LA, and it's a city in constant flux. So I think that one of the good things about the show is that it allows you to do a very international show while keep it kind of like rooted in a sense of place. The other challenge is that you cannot think of a concept and then select a group of artists you like. So, like usually if as a curator you're invited to curate an international Biennale, you would say like, I want to talk about ecology, or, and then you select the artists. You might do a studio visit, but you already know what you want. In the case of Made in LA, you need to start with art. You need to focus on what's actually happening. And from there, you develop whatever curatorial concept. In the case of this edition, we didn't think of a topic. So there is really like a polyphony of artists, but we thought about some kind of like ethos that would speak of a way of working, because that way of working was what allowed us to develop the project, like some kind of curatorial methodology. So Acts of Living is part of a quote by Noah Purifoy. I'm sure you all know about his work. It's inscribed on a plaque in the Watts Towers, and like the Watts Towers was one of the first places we visited when doing the visits. And, like, I don't know if you've been there, but it's really impressive. I mean, it was at least impressive to me. These huge towers constructed over, I think that it took between 30 and 35 years by an Italian immigrant. He was a construction worker. And one day he just decided to get out of bed and do that at night for 30 years. So, for me, the question is what's going on there? Like, in what, I don't know, it's not something that will happen every day, right? Like you think, okay, I'm gonna just do this and see what happens. So there is something going on there that speaks to a form of artistic practice that is, that it works as some kind of like driven force. And I call it in the text I wrote for this catalog, the will to create, which for me is this kind of like very vital force that moves you to do things. And those things happen to be art. And you don't do it because you're gonna show it, you don't do it necessarily because you're gonna sell it. Not that that is wrong, but there is a very kind of more primal necessity in doing things, as we learn with the watchtowers. And that kind of like primal necessity that comes out of desire, and that for me it comes also out of an instinct that is deeply rooted in diasporic and indigenous cultures. For me, like, there is a very kind of sort of endemic relationship between creativity and your experience as an immigrant or your experience as an indigenous folk and so on. Not exclusively, but there is something going on there. And then when we were doing the business, we realized that so many artists were kind of relating to that ethos, knowing or not knowing, seeing the watchtowers or not. So these are the watchtowers. Also, they are really beautiful. This is Simon Rodia. Also, like, when you research, there are like different names that he would use, so still like kind of like a debate on what was his real name. It also looks like very kind of otherworldly. And this is still not the show, but part of it. This is Teresa Tolliver. She's on exhibition. I'll tell you a little more about her. So she was doing this kind of work. It feels like watchtowers, no? Somehow. This is Maria Maella in front of one of her sculptures, working with palm. This was a piece at Murmurs. This is Chiffon Thomas, non-binary artist working on kind of like continuing the tradition of black assemblage. Also chiffon. And this was the day of the opening. I think one night before, everyone was running around and trying to finish, and we were late. And like, I don't know if some of you went, but there was so many people for the opening. Around, I don't know, 6,000-7,000 people came for the opening party. I've never seen something like that. Because Biennales, and again, that's something very kind of made in LA, is that you do Biennales and people travel, right? Like artists and friends, but so you have this kind of like group of people that landed in the city for like a week and then they leave. And then you have visitors, but the thing is that Made in LA really feels like people is just hanging with their friends and their family. And since then, there's been also a lot of buzz and people is coming. So we selected 39 artists. These artists are of very, very different ages. One of the reasons for this is that Made in LA has been usually considered a kind of like I don't know how you call it, like emergent arts, young arts biennale, but there's been always this kind of sense of novelty. So you would go to Made in LA expecting to see something that you haven't seen in the city or something, kind of discovering voices or something. But in this case, we really try to work against that, meaning that emergent art is also a really kind of complicated category. So we thought that we would include lots of older voices. So every section has one or two artists that are kind of anchoring the whole constellation, and these artists are usually in their 70s or 80s. And then younger artists, and it would be very moving because sometimes you will see that Chiffon, the one that you saw before, would be like, oh, I didn't know the work of Teresa Tolliver, the one before with the Lions. And there is this kind of instant connection. So that's one thing. The other is that why I was talking about identity politics at the beginning is that we didn't start with the idea of, we didn't think about demographics at the beginning, at least when we did the visits. We did so many visits. It was like around 200 visits. It's insane. I would never do that again because you are driving and then you need to organize. It was like 4 visits a day. So yeah, at some point it becomes too intense, and also like there is no way you can see 4 artists in a day. I mean, like that your brain is still working in the same way. But like we did it because I think that we kind of thought that it was important. We had, of course, a timeline, so we were like, okay, we have like 8 months to do the studio visits. Most of them were in real life, and most of them were the 2 of us, because we didn't wanted to negotiate what are, this moment where I would be like, with the co-curator, Diana, I saw this artist, and it's not the same. You need to take the decisions together if you want the show to feel cohesive. And I think that that's one of the good things about the show is that, I mean, I don't want to talk good about the show, but I think it feels cohesive. And the reason is that we took the decisions together. So we did most of the visits together, a few online when I was in Berlin. And after doing the first filtering of artists, we have around 80 something. And then we put it like on 50 or something. But when we did the demographics, we realized that more than 80% were, brown, indigenous, and black folks. And out of those, a good number were self-identify as women, and a good number was non-binary. But the thing is that, again, that logic is tricky. It was just interesting to realize that we have such a kind of like a polyphony of voices, and that out of those, most of them were non-white artists. And the reason is that those were the artists doing the best fucking work in the city. So it's not just about like, again, it's not about demographics. It's that there is something going on with artists and the way that they work. And if we go back to art, and if we go back to the art object, we will realize that, again, it's not about representation. Something else is happening, and I think that we try to somehow show that in the exhibition. Yeah. So this is, I'm going to walk you through the show. Not going to talk about every single piece, but you're going to see spaces, like different spaces in the show. This is the lobby. I don't know if you've been in the Hammer recently, but there was this kind of new project, the kind of like construction thing. So this is a new lobby. It's a little bigger, and this is the first time the lobby is used. Sorry, no, the second time. The lobby is used for like a commission with this new version. And this is Devin Reynolds with graffiti and these panels. And the panels are, one of the things with Devin and, I don't know, like Alfonso Gonzalez or Osi Juarez is that, there's been this movement of young Mexican-American artists mostly doing, kind of internalizing the logics of street art into fine art somehow. So they are doing panels, they are working with canvas, but also they are doing a stencil, airbrush, very textural. So, Devin is, I believe, part of that movement, and we decided to go with this kind of hybrid work between like, mural and the panels. It was very stressful because he had to do it in 3 weeks. Just for different reasons, and so he had 2 people helping, and this is just internal information, so you cannot say it. But he was sleeping the last days at the museum because there was no way he could finish without it. And then sometimes you would come and like at 3 p.m. and he would be like taking a nap in the lobby. This is also his. These are the panels. It's a big piece. So this is one of the entry of the galleries. The piece that you see on the right side is Ambos, which is a artist kind of platform collective based on the U.S.-Mexico border. And they are really amazing, and it's led by Tania Aguñiga and Carla Aguñiga and many other artists. And they did this piece that is a collaborative piece made through workshops with undocumented people, and they will do these hands with clay and this called escapularios, which is, I don't know if you know escapularios, these Catholic kind of relics that people would use kind of like to, as an amulet of sorts. So it's also these beautiful sort of escapularios, and the pieces, you can touch it and you can listen to the kind of conversations with them, and it smells very good because it has, what is the name of this plant that is purple and it smells very good? Lavender, yeah. Thank you. This is the kind of first moment in the show, very painterly. So Tira Whitney here, incredible painter, young, Long Beach, kind of juxtaposing images of, well, she's of Cambodian descent and doing this thing with like, I don't know, the Cambodian genocide on the bottom, and then these very kind of domestic, intimate scenes. Also, you cannot see well, but there is this creepy hand behind the closet, like kind of going out of the closet. That's kind of very Tira, and so she's kind of doing this thing with light, could be LA, could be Cambodia, but also feels a little bit like very normal, but then you have these very hardcore kind of horror scenes and some kind of like tropical gothic. So again, like some creepy hands there. This is moving to the other room. Joy Terrell, an important Chicano artist working very actively as well in the 80s and 90s. He moved to New York in the 80s, and also he would do all of these beautiful portraits of his family, lovers, friends. So it's a very kind of like painting as a way of memorializing a community. But also, you know, it's kind of very pop. Paintings have no light, a little flat, and also this kind of very cinematographic sort of approach with this other piece like that you see on the right. Christopher Suarez, Long Beach. He's the only one on the pictures. Like there are no more artists. I don't know. I think it's because the pictures that I have you cannot see the ceramic from the like close up. So this is ceramic, all of the thing, and it is like a maquette. It's Long Beach, and it is the neighborhood where he grew up. Straightforward ceramicist. He studied in Long Beach as well, and it's a very beautiful moving piece. All the sign painting, the details, very tender. And again, like the thing with pieces like this is that there is part of the artists that were in the show. There is some kind of like, there is no critical distance, but it's a very kind of earnest work. And there is something about, there is no irony in the work, you know, so it takes distance from this kind of more clean sort of whatever conceptual minimal traditions of the avant-garde. So it's happening a lot, I think. It's, you know, this is my family, this is my community, this is my block. This is the same section, Marcel Alcalá on the right, Pei Moon, a Korean artist on the left side, with these miniature paintings that are beautiful. And she's, again, similar to Christopher, depicting very domestic scenes, like her husband taking a nap with her baby, or her mother doing the dishes. Marcel doing these paintings. Marcel is a performance artist, and also during the pandemic started to paint, and you know, it's very Marcel, like very performative and vernacular, and references to Mexican like cultura popular. So we moved to the other room. So we try as much as possible to have open spaces. All of the artists are in relation to each other with the exception of one, Guadalupe Rosales. And that was, I mean, part of what I was saying, right? Like, I mean, it's about access and it is about connections. And we bet for this model of an exhibition. It's not the only one. Like, there are being other made in LAs that are very kind of like project-based. So you have maybe like 13 artists or 12 with like one room for them. So just a different way. Teresa that you see on the bottom, to the right side, that here on the bottom is Akinsanya Kambon. He's on his 80s. Teresa probably late 70s. So these two artists are kind of anchoring that space. Akinsanya is a Vietnam veteran and a former Black Panther. And also he infamously kind of, I mean, I say infamously because then the book was banned, but he designed the Black Panther coloring book. And then the book was kind of banned by the Black Panther, so he has this very kind of nuanced relationship to that history. And he has traveled the world. He spent a lot of time in Africa. So there is this kind of thing of the idea of doing ceramics as a way of telling stories. So his workshop, his studio in Long Beach is huge, and he has so many pieces. He, again, works compulsively, and he's not working with a gallery. Teresa is also, well, maybe recently started working with one. But again, that speaks to this idea of acts of living and, kind of the will to create and keep doing things. So here we move, this is Sula Bermudez, the hands with these balls. And sorry, to go back. This whole section speaks to ideas of horror and colonial histories, because there are many artists, again, kind of dealing with that in different ways. Religion is also very present. This is Chiffon Thomas. He would lift this like once a week, so the sculpture goes up and down. Also chiffon, that's a different room, so this is kind of the perspective of the space. And in front of, to the front of chiffon, there is Maria Maella. And Maria, probably you've seen her work. She's one of these artists that I think is part of probably a new moment in contemporary art where artists are pushing the limits of materials, in the sense that materials, there is this acknowledging of materials having a history and having kind of like their own agency. But that logic or that sensibility comes from their own personal trajectories or histories. So it is not by chance that many indigenous artists are working with stones or soil, because there is some kind of like agency and some kind of liveness in the materials. And that has many implications, because for artists means that what you do is to produce, you need to be in constant dialogue with the materials that you're using. And then also there is some kind of contingent aspect in the work. So for instance, with this piece, Maria had to weave the palm on site. So this was created at the museum. So we took the palm from Maria, and then we had to fumigate the whole thing because it has bugs and stuff, and then you imagine in front of chiffon. And so it's very, very tricky. So that's one thing. Maria had to kind of negotiate with the palm to see what would come out of it. And the other implication is that for museums, this is a total nightmare, because you need to treat the materials before, and also because just imagine how would you acquire a work like this for a collection. It would change, it would deteriorate, and there are many things, and probably works are not meant to last forever, and that's a question that probably museums have to come to terms with. Can you get a work that probably in 10 years will not exist? Or are you willing to get a work that you are not buying, but you are kind of getting in custodianship for a number of years, and so on? So again, Maria is sort of a kind of paradigmatic example of this. Moving to the other room, to the other gallery spaces, this is Teresa Baker, working with abstraction and kind of map making in indigenous land. This is AstroTurf, so very harsh material, but these beautiful compositions. Ryan at the side of Teresa. So this area speaks to indigenous craft a little more and materiality. Ryan is doing this furniture. He has a background he's a carpenter, and he has been designing furniture for many years. And at some point he started moving towards kind of art objects. And there are references they are very modernist, and some references to like Bauhaus design, or as well Chumash design. This is another view of the room. Melissa Cody, very well-known Diné Navajo weaver, doing these compositions that are references, of course, to like Diné Navajo, like the crosses are very typical of Navajo textile, but also kind of blending that with digital kind of design and sort of references to early Nintendo design. You move to this other room. So you see all of the works are in some kind of like connection. This moves towards more kind of like abstract painting. Kyle Kilty on the right side with these very materic paintings that you see also on the bottom there. Kyle hasn't shown at all in museums or galleries. Someone told us about him. We went to his studio, and he has been working on the weekends for years. He works in like set design, and on Saturdays he paints. So it was really amazing to discover just this universe of 10 years of painting and not really showing at all. This is Erika Mahenay in front of Kyle, working with silk and very kind of translucent materials. And, like the sculptures are also hers. Okay, so this is Jackie Mesquita. Jackie studied at UCLA, and she's Guatemalan, and she came to the US as she came undocumented when she was a teenager. And then around her 30s, she decided to study art. And it was really a wonderful surprise to see her work. These are 144 slabs made of a mix of soil collected from the 144 neighborhoods in LA and corn mass, like corn dough, masa. And she would kind of bake these slabs separately. So you would come to her studio and it would really smell like tortilla. Unlike Guatemalan tortilla, because I guess there is something about the mix or something. And similar than with Maria, these will change and will decay, and the cracks of the slabs will grow. Each of the slabs has a drawing. You cannot see here probably. And those drawings are inspiring very kind of urban scenes of those neighborhoods. So again, feels like a very kind of like minimal piece, but also when you get closer, it has this sort of density. Beatriz Cortez, which maybe you know, she was at the opening and she was saying like, this, she was very moved because she was like, this makes me think that the only thing we have left to create is soil. So yeah, it was just a beautiful piece. And it's also kind of big. You can see a little better here. And this is Roxana Piersman, also a former student from UCLA, and she did this window, and she comes and stays inside the window once a week. The window connects the two spaces, so it also kind of architecturally allows us to connect visually two gallery spaces. One window is a reference to an LA kind of architecture, the other to Iran. She came as an Iranian refugee. And inside you have like these dresses of her grandmother and the curtains, and there are pictures and love letters that will be blowing. So there is this air that is blowing everything away. So when she performs, she would be trying to kind of like read the letters, but then the air blows everything away constantly. Another view, this is Luis Bermudez, the only deceased artist in the show. Usually made in LA don't have deceased artists because, again, it's considered a kind of like a emergent art biennale. So in this case, we made the case, and he passed 2 years ago, and he barely showed work, and long-time educator, teaching for many decades, working with ceramics, or kind of treating ceramic as a sculpture, more or less, Mesoamerican iconography. And this is Ishiglinsky, Native American artist, and well, this is very big, and he speaks about indigenizing popular, like pop culture, and it would be, it's obviously references to the Scream movie. And when he showed us the sketch, we were, of course, thinking like very excited, but also wondering how is this gonna look? Like imagine like you just see this sketch with a huge screen mask, like, and he somehow pulled it off, and it looks great. People love it, and it's today. I was doing a tour, and someone was like, you have this because you see this, and then you see Ishi. So you have this very kind of sort of minimal, kind of more sort of conceptual place, abstract, and then you move to this huge mask in the middle of the room. And the regalia is made in collaboration with the different Native American artists across the country. So that's something about Ishi's as well, that his practice connects to, is kind of like an excuse to collaborate with other indigenous artists. Some of them well-known, and some others really like more artisans and local artists. So the piece that you see, for instance, on the bottom, this with like brown and red, is Teresa Baker, which was the artist you just saw with working with AstroTurf. And then, besides like the main gallery spaces, there are some satellite projects. This is Gary Garay. He's a visual artist, but also he's a DJ, and he has built this archive with this project called Más Éxitos, and it's an archive, a huge archive of kind of diasporic Latin, kind of Latin techno and house, and he will organize these monthly parties at Footsies. And kind of the challenge was, okay, we want to invite Gary, but we don't want him to treat this space as an, I mean, he's an artist, but we were interested in his performative kind of side of the practice and in the archive. So he proposed this installation that he actually works when he's doing something there. So he's organizing events, like listening sessions, parties. And like last week, he invited these like two like kind of music nerds to speak about cumbia and electrocumbia and house. And he would sit with them, there would be people seated, and they would be playing records, and then at some point people would just get up and dance. So the whole space really works as some kind of like performative space for events. This is another view. Those pieces at the bottom are made on abalone, and it is also inspiring diseño popular. Dominique Moody with this studio house at Lynbrook side of the museum. She proposed this house as some solution to the housing crisis in LA. But also there is this whole thing with her life. She's been moving from within cities for a long, long time. And her idea was to actually live and produce in that house. It's illegal to do that in LA, so now she's kind of dealing with that, treating also the piece as an art object. And yeah, this is one of the pieces that, you know, like really speaks, I think, to the idea of acts of living and how you really kind of merge your time, your life with your art practice. Roxana Piersman, which is the same one of the window that you saw before. And this has like running water, and then this steel is getting, how do you say oxidado? Rusted, yeah, thank you. And finally, this is Los Angeles Contemporary Archive. They are incredible. They are in Chinatown. You should go. And they are doing this. They've been working with this archive, but it's like an archive in a non-precious way. So it's like really documenting the life of artists and cultural practitioners, and kind of like their dilemmas in daily life. So they would collect emails when, like, for instance, someone is fired. They would collect documents from unions, receipts from artists, and like gigs and things. So they are really kind of trying to systematize a kind of sort of material kind of like culture and strategies of survival of like the creative community in LA. So they proposed this project called the Break Room. So it's literally emulating a break room in an office. That's why it looks so sad. And it's also funny because it's in front of the real break room of the museum. So you cannot see the other side because it's with like blackened, and the windows are blackened. But if you cross to the other side, like right in front, the break room of the Hammer is, and it looks really similar. They have this archive with boxes, so you can come and check the documents, but also these kind of vitrines that you see on the left side. So you will see also some objects on display there from the archive. They organize events on Wednesdays, and they give you coffee. They design these beautiful mugs for people to drink coffee. So it just felt right to have them here, and it's the only project that is probably more kind of socially activated. They have a vendor machine. And finally, this is Guadalupe Rosales. This is the only project that we have in a single gallery space. This is Gallery 6. It's a very small space. You know, like it was kind of a back and forth, but in the end, she proposed this installation. You know, like reference to lowrider culture. There are these portals that is a work that she has produced in the past, and these disco balls that are reference to. It could be like a Tenochtitlan pyramid, and there is silence, so there is no sound in the space. It looks like, but there is not. And yeah, it feels like a very kind of like heavy, like clubby, almost kind of like spiritual space. It were really good. And this is a picture of the Ares. Okay.